Welcome back, Left Reckoners. Really stoked to be talking about this today. We have Ryan Zickgraf. You can read their work in Jacobin magazine. They're journalists. They also have an excellent substack called Third Rail that you should certainly be checking out. But we brought Brian on because he wrote a piece, and it was one of those things that immediately piqued my interest. On Halloween night in 1891, Tennessee miners made righteous mayhem. And, as people know on this show, we love to tell all these labor stories, particularly the unheard or unknown ones. And, before we get into this bit here, Ryan, I mean, like, this story is about one of these big fights that is very contemporary today about the use of prison labor to basically legally enslave people and to use forced labor. And it's notable because in Alabama, Tennessee, Oregon, and Vermont, there were amendments and there were ballot initiatives to remove slavery loopholes in these states, and it was successful in Tennessee. So could you, just sort of set that stage for us about the historical nature, then also if you could shed some light on some of the interesting things that happened with this new Tennessee decision as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when this article about the Coal Creek War was first assigned to me, I didn't really know that slavery was going to be on the ballot. It was an interesting, coincidence that, these four states put it on the ballot to, the 13th Amendment had this loophole that, slavery was abolished, except for prisoners, except for people convicted of felonies. So for the longest time, we've had people sometimes, in the 80s, 1890s, it would have been people like maybe convicted for stealing a pig. Whereas in contemporary times, it might be for possessing a certain kind of marijuana. And it's just Southern leaders have figured out a way over time to adjust it so that in Tennessee in the 1890s, it was sort of like you directly employed these convicts to work on private mining, but then they changed the game a little bit so that these prisoners worked on a state-run mine, and then later they got paid, but it was like cents per hour. So the state has sort of adjusted to the times. And so it is kind of unbelievable. And I think, you saw this response on social media, the fact that Fox News ran this banner. It said something like, "Oh, slavery end," and you guys decided slavery ends. And a lot of people were shocked, but it just kind of shows you how especially Black people and incarceration, and how convict leasing is something that the state of Tennessee and other states have dealt with for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and you were noting to us before too that, like, well, one I just want to say on that, like, the banner was pretty amazing. I totally agree, but, like, remember that there's a lot of states where this is still on the books. So, like, there was a little bit of smugness here where it's like, this is a good thing and a victory. And there's a lot of states, I believe California being one of them, where, like, you'd want to see something like that happen there too. But still, I mean, you gotta workshop that before you put slavery ban to Tennessee on Twitter on election night.
No,
what's best? Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, the California thing was kind of amazing because California is seen as like this deep blue state, and the fact that they decided not to move on that because of the deficits. So they're like, well, we can still have sort of this kind of slavery, guys, it's expensive. We have a big budget.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that's what's fascinating about sort of like the surface level reaction to it. It's like it's one of those old art like laws on the books, and we just forgot to get rid of it. But no, this is a very real purpose that coercion of labor serves for, like, and lawmakers are fully aware of that. Yeah, that's crazy.
But so let's take us back to this moment in Tennessee labor history, though, because it's a really interesting story, and it's fascinating to see 100+ years later, that there are a lot of these fights still ongoing. But before we talk to about the exact moment and the fights that were happening there, could you set the scene for us a little bit? Like, take us to Tennessee in 1891, and like, one, what prisoners were facing, but two, what these coal and iron workers were facing in the state as well.
Well, so this era after Reconstruction in America, there were labor battles everywhere at this time. In the past, I've written about like the Great Upheaval of 1877, and this was a few years after May Day happened in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
and the Haymarket affair, and so like this was a moment where a lot of workers were beginning to unionize. Like the labor movement was still a fledgling enterprise, and so in Tennessee there were company towns, including one in Coal Creek, and they promised workers, good wages, good job. And so you had a lot of immigrants come over to work in these company towns. And then what they experienced wasn't exactly what they were promised. You had low wages, sometimes wages that weren't even in cash, they were company script. So you could only buy
Mm-hmm.
stuff from the company store. Mining at the time was extremely dangerous. Not only the chemicals that you inhaled constantly get black lung, but also explosions were common at the time. In fact, in Coal Creek, this was after all the Coal Creek War. In the early 1900s, there was a massive accident that an explosion that killed dozens of people there. So
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about long hours. I mean, at this time, people were often working 80, 90, 100-hour weeks. Again, low pay. And so the workers in Tennessee were starting to agitate, and they were starting to actually gain ground and get some concessions with their employers. So convict leasing started as a way to kind of, well, it had a couple of purposes. One was to disenfranchise the recently freed slaves, and also to provide a substitute labor force that
Mm-hmm.
they didn't spend hardly any money on. The prisoners could not unionize; they could not rise up against it. So, yeah, it was sort of a sneaky way for corporations to break unions.
And I'm just going to pop this up here right quick, folks, because you have a couple of photos that you sent us. I appreciate that so much. I mean, this is a photo of, I mean, unless you had any biographical info you want to share here. I mean, this is a photo of the mining process. You can see, it's not the most like technologically advanced, which means that people are putting themselves at risk. And here's a photo as well of some of these, convict laborers who are being leased out as well, right? And
Yeah,
I think that one thing that's really notable in your piece here too is that there are two aspects to utilizing this form of labor. It's like, one, it's cheap, but two, to try to quell like the worker consciousness, the working class power that is building up in the area. And it could be a very effective thing because you basically have like state sponsored scab program, of people who are highly abused by this system to come in anytime, laborers say, we're not going to work for these wages. We're not going to work under these conditions.
yeah, and so what they did, what the state did was, again, arrest a lot of especially black men for just either small charges, or sometimes they would, you know, make something up.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden they were charged with these felonies and had to work for years. And the conditions were even worse than for, these immigrant European miners. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you had child labor, you had no hospitals, barely any kind of healthcare whatsoever. So it was rough. It was a hard way to work.
Yeah, and obviously people understood the conditions, right? Like the working people understood what this was, that this was bad. You built some really interesting solidarity at a time when you might not expect that to be the case in the 1890s in the South. Um, but before we get into like the actual, Coal Creek War itself, I mean, one thing that you noted in the piece is that there were political attempts to end this program, and I was just wondering if you could frame for the audience like how well those went.
Well, so I should maybe give a little more background as far as
Yeah.
like the Coal Creek War, because you hear war and you think, it's maybe just this period of battles where what we're really talking about is like a year and a half of mostly like labor struggles and some sort of like waiting, because like in the winter they didn't really do anything, and so
Hmm.
nothing really much happened in the winter. But what you had is so in 1891, these iron and mining companies, again, that had just gave some concessions to these miners, um, they all of a sudden go under repairs, and then when they come back they have convict leasing, and then so that's when some of these miners start to organize, and they start to figure out what to do. And it wasn't until a few months later, once they started creating havoc and setting some of these convict laborers free, that's when they ended up getting a meeting with the governor. I mean, they really had
Hmm.
they had to stir some shit to get the
Hmm.
governor to come down and have some talks. So um, they talked to this Governor John Buchanan, who runs as sort of a populist, but at the same time, when he was a state legislator, he actually voted for convict labor. So he had this like John Buchanan is an interesting dude because he's a little bit like Pontius Pilate, I feel like, where he, maybe had some moral convictions and some political convictions, but capital was so massive that it just seemed like that he had to dance for capital. But so he had a meeting with these miners, and he said, "Hey, you guys chill for 2 months, 60 days, and I'll see what I can do with the state legislature, and I'll, we'll figure something out." So that was a good start, but 60 days later it came back, and it was the opposite of what the miners wanted. The state legislature actually made it a felony to interfere with convict leasing.
Hmm.
So that didn't quite go over.
Yeah, and just like, I mean, you might be able to describe this better than me, Ryan, but like, I think sometimes people who don't know like Southern history, well, like, don't understand how much of a bonanza there was in the South post Civil War, particularly like in coal, in iron, and railroad. I mean, people made huge fortunes. So you started to see it's not that, the old ruling class was completely liquidated, but there was this kind of rising industrial, ruling class in states like Tennessee in particular, where there was a lot of money to be made that was wielding a lot of power in the state. But yeah, and then you see this like large immigrant group of people who are moving there to work these mines. Um,
And
so mhm,
I would also say that these southern states were also, really poor
yeah,
right after the Civil War, and so they were like, "Come on in." They tried to get all of these entrepreneurs, all of these businesses in, and they're like, "Have whatever you want. We just need more money in the coffers."
yeah. No, I mean it's pretty it's a pretty fascinating point in American like capitalism if you compare it, for example, what was happening in the Northeast, just because in a lot of places it wasn't as developed, so it was like industrializing really quickly, and those effects were
Right.
seen like in like a generation. People were really experiencing the effect of this system.
That's
Um,
effectively a new market being opened, right? Like,
yeah.
whereas you just had like plantation owners saying, "Well, that's my mountain over there. We'll get to it when we get to it." You have all of a sudden like the entire like finance and northern industry being like, Let's get some of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and that's honestly a lot of the history of the West. You know, we talk
Yeah.
about like
totally.
of the Wild West and all that, but a lot of that was capitalist expansion.
Mhm.
Yep.
So we have this, this, people are pushing back. They're seeing the problems with this brutal system here. One, like, because you mentioned a little bit, but I'd be curious to know, like, what kinds of organizations like these miners were forming, if they were like what we would consider to be unions, or if they were more sort of community-based things. And then how do they end up like taking this fight into their own hands and opening up like the next chapter in the wars there?
Well, so when I was investigating this story, like I said, I went up to, which is now called actually Rocky Top,
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee, and it's about a half an hour northwest of Knoxville. And shit, I lost my thread. Wait, what did you? I'm sorry, I like totally.
No worries.
spaced out.
I was sort of asking, like, what kind of like unions and organizations were these workers forming, and then how did they end up taking this fight more directly?
So yeah, it was mostly informal. I mean, because there was so much class consciousness and there was so much class struggle going on at this time,
Mm-hmm.
chances are a lot of the workers that were going to be in Tennessee had wind of some of the other things that were going on all over the country. Like I said, this big thing in Chicago had happened 5 years previous, and there were countless number of miners and iron workers and other laborers that were engaged in struggles. But in this case, a lot of them were a tight-knit community.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them were Welsh. And in fact, what I was going to say was that Barry, who I met in Coal Creek, was cosplaying as a Welsh miner, and he was telling me the story. He'd done all of this work to like embody
Mm-hmm.
this one Welsh miner who ended up, a lot of his archives ended up going to Harvard. So we know more about this one particular miner that he was sort of
Mm-hmm.
role playing as. But from what I understand, they were just a very tight knit community. And so they had a sort of like informal, they had, like community meetings, and they were all, I mean, we're not talking about a lot of people. We're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
a couple hundred people. And so they just sort of organized independently. But the thing is I think what's interesting too is they were very measured. They weren't, they didn't go out in the streets and start firebombing things right away. This was, again, months. This whole thing was like, a year and a half, and they were very reasonable. So at first they tried to talk it out. And once the governor was like, we actually made it illegal for you guys to do anything about this, that's when they decided to sort of do extrajudicial justice. And that's when they started going to some of these stockades where the convicts were being held, and, like in the middle of the night, and they would set the facilities on fire, and then gave the convicts, they set them free, gave them some civilian clothes, and said, hey, you're free, do whatever you want. Great.
I mean, it's a really incredible like active resistance there, both like on the moral level of like freeing prisoners who are being held in labor, and then two, like breaking some of the power of these coal companies and iron companies over people and their community.
And I love, I began this story. It was supposed to be sort of an anniversary piece, so I started on Halloween night, and I just love it's sort of evocative to have these miners that are wearing masks, so they can't be identified, and then coming with torches to this mining company's stockades, burning everything, setting the prisoners free. Like it's I kind of talk about this in my piece, but it sort of seems like an elaborate Halloween prank, but it was very serious.
Yeah.
And I don't think people have really an appreciation, like mining company stockades. Like imagine if Amazon warehouses had stockades. Like what an absurd,
Mhm.
concept that is. Like, just for
Yeah.
folks, stockades are the things you put your, like in the cartoons, like people held with their arms, and like, is that the type of stockades we're thinking? Do you know like what they look like? These sort of stockades?
Yeah, I haven't seen them, but you're probably on something. But yeah, another detail I love is that some of these miners, again, and it was cool, this solidarity between these white workers and these black convicts, that some of them got train tickets to go to Nashville.
Oh wow. So the miners were funding the travel for freed convicts as well.
Yeah, and
That's amazing. Yeah,
yeah, go on over to Nashville.
That's really fast. I mean, that's the. So I mean, I'm assuming this story sort of ends after that because the mining companies, saw the error in their ways and they backed down and ended the system, right?
No. So after the Halloween night incident, there's a lot of pressure on the governor to because of this act of anarchy, as a lot of the journalists and lawmakers called it at the time. There was pressure on him to do something more with force, but he kind of sat on it. Winter was coming, and so he waited 2 months to do anything, and then that's when he started sending state militia and troops to do something about it. So that's when on this mountain, which I got to visit, is where the militias, they brought a Gatling gun with them, which in this recent of time had been most recently used on Native Americans, and now they had it up to use on workers, which is pretty crazy.
And were the workers sort of organizing themselves into militias, or were they trying to flee the violence?
They knew that when you're fighting against hundreds of armed militia, that you're not going to do conventional warfare. So a lot of it looked like what we might call like guerrilla warfare, sneaking around, doing things like late at night, doing things where that they're not stationed. So they try to do things chill because these are the militia, these are the army, these are the guys with the guns. So you're not gonna challenge them head on.
But I mean, this did have like a significant effect. Like, just like, we talked about, a story I wrote for Jacobin a little while was about the fence cutting wars here in Texas. They lose that war. The coal mining wars in West Virginia, like they lose that war in the sense of like, tactically they're outgunned by the state. But it had a big effect on politics. And, what happened sort of in the aftermath of this conflict?
I should also say that there was like a couple of direct, well, I'd say like kind of small skirmishes and battles. And at one point, the miners do actually capture a militia commander and hold them hostage. But yeah, their successes are definitely short-lived. And I don't have an exact number of people who died in this war, but there definitely was more casualties on the miner side than the state militia and authorities. But yeah, it didn't necessarily go even after all of this stuff happened, the miners, it was a slow victory, because I mean, what happened with a lot of them is they got blacklisted from working anywhere else, and so a lot of them had misery for the next few years. But part of what happened, which was good, was that the governor was up for re-election, and so one of his opponents was campaigning on this issue specifically, and saying that this is sort of the shame of Tennessee. I don't know if you have that ad that I sent you.
Yes, let me pull it up really quick,
because I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I put it somewhere. Here it is. Excuse me. Tennessee's shame: convicts in the Coal Creek mines.
Yeah. So this governor candidate who ended up winning was campaigning on this issue. And so, again, capital had a lot of power. And so this issue lingered. And it wasn't until 1865 where they actually stopped this particular system.
Just going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, I mean, so effectively what's ended is the convict lease system, but the ability of prison labor to be utilized for other kind of money-making opportunities still existed in some form or another.
Yeah, unfortunately, for a lot of the miners in this area, it was good news to them because they were able to work in these mines and to make a decent living eventually, but yeah, again, so what the state did, and I think it's called like the Lone Star, they had a state-controlled mine. So you're no longer leasing them. You are just using them directly. And that's, you hear a lot about the chain gangs and things like that. Like prisoners were being used for labor for a long time and still, again, being used in similar ways even today.
So like this is such a fascinating story. One, because like it's very inspiring. People really brave. While they didn't get everything that they might have wanted, it made a difference in the lives of people by ending this form of exploitation.
Although I will say that you could say that the miners did have an impact because Tennessee was the first state to stop this practice in 1895, and in the end, it didn't totally end convict labor, but it was an important victory at the time.
Oh, totally. I mean, like it's a huge one, especially like getting those private hands directly out of control of human beings. I mean, is a truly frightening merging of like capital and slave labor to think about developing in which it was like very clearly developing in the South. But like you have all these factors, right? It's like this really incredible like labor struggle, this really great like cross-racial struggle at a time, when a lot of people won't expect that kind of thing, like real human solidarity being shown between people. Because if anything, the way that this story you could imagine a version of this story where it just sort of inspires like race hate crimes. Because like the miners are pissed at the system, they create animus, and that's sort of what these things are typically intended to do. But these miners having that kind of long-sightedness, being able to understand what was being done to them to actually directly wage war on the coal companies and try to free these convicts, I mean, is a really inspiring story. And it's also like I think is really important in places like the South where a lot of people don't recognize sometimes this labor history. But you were just up there, and I have some of the photos that you took, because I think it's also notable. It's like these things are sort of lost to history, and it's not too accidental. So could you talk a little bit about how this, the process of this story sort of being unearthed again for people to understand, the history of the part of the country that they live in?
Sure. So I happened to reach out because I just did a little Googling because I wanted to come up there, see it in person. And it's mostly been this one organization called the Coal Creek Watershed Foundation. And part of what's interesting about them is that they're not leftists. They didn't intend this to be like, we want to honor the workers or anything like that. They, were engineers or worked for mining companies and wanted to preserve this area and some of the other history. In fact, they also have a memorial for the Welsh miners who died a couple decades later. But so they showed me maps from the 1960s where this mountain where this militia base was for the Coal Creek War, like the sort of the crux of this war, was a trash dump, was just a bunch of garbage. And it didn't change until the early 2000s. That's when they started to make efforts to preserve this. So, if you would have came there 20 years ago, you just saw a pile of trash. You wouldn't have thought anything about it. So, this group started cleaning it up. They actually purchased some of the property because it was like privately owned. And they did cleanup efforts, and then they worked with the state to recognize this as a historic site. They installed signs to tell you a little bit the history of the Coal Creek. They even did replica cannons. And then Barry, who I met, and Carol Moore, they do like tours with Tennessee high school students. And Barry puts on his like Welsh miner costume, and they give him a little taste of the history. So it's pretty cool.
It's awesome. Oh, you're unmuted.
Sorry, yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating. Something that we love being able to cover here on Left Reckoning. And thank you so much, Ryan, for putting this out in Jacobin and joining us today to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Again, I'm a big history buff, and I love labor history, so it's excited to write about this.
Well, hell yeah. We'll put links below for people to follow Ryan and all of their work. And yeah, man, really appreciate it, and hope to do it again soon sometime.
Sounds good. Thank you, guys.